and gentlemen, if I can have your attention. I know everybody's having a great time, but if I could have your attention. The old shh works every time. Shh. Maybe if we all do it together. My next assignment is for my Brett. Please go ask the bartender to turn off the music. When he's your child, you can bark at them like that, right? But these two fine young men, when I came tonight at 6 o'clock, were playing darts over here, and I shooed them away from the dartboard, and now they've been moving furniture for me ever since. So will you give them a round of applause? Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. They're not from Beacon, but we won't hold that against them, right? So, all right. Okay, thank you so much. So, the more I love you, the more I put you to work, as most people who know me will tell you. My name is Denise Van Buren, and I am the president of the Beacon Historical Society. And back in January or so, Two-Way Brewing contacted us and said, boy, we'd like to have a little history program here. Would you be interested in doing it? And so I said, sure, of course. And that's what brought us to, we are doing 6 lectures here. This is the 3rd of 6. So I think a couple of you are now on your 3rd. You've got the complete set. Raise your hand if you've come in for all 3. Okay, great. Well, we appreciate it. I'm going to wait till the music gets shut off overhead. Can I give you a couple of commercial messages while we're waiting? If you are not yet a member of the Beacon Historical Society, I hope that you will consider joining us. If you're from Beacon, maybe you've noticed it's changing a little bit. Would you agree with that? So our goal at the Historical Society is to make everyone understand the great history that's here and what makes this such a wonderful community. And by joining us, you help to support that effort. We're based up at the old St. Joachim's Rectory, which is 61 Leonard Street. We have 3 floors of space in our collection, thousands of items that we consider ourselves to be the stewards of Beacon history. And by joining us, you get our free monthly newsletter. I've got a couple copies here on the end. That's the legal size. If you want to grab some of those, we have monthly lectures, and we also have special events like our Beacons of History Award. Sir, we have a chair right here. You got a chair? Very good. Okay. All right. Whew. Another. Is anybody? I'm feeling bad for the standers. Do you want a chair?
No, I'm happy to stand.
You sure? Okay. All right. Thank you. So that was my commercial message for the Beacon Historical Society. Hopefully you all have a little pink door prize ticket, and we'll draw that at the end of the night in appreciation for all of you coming tonight. And I would be remiss if I didn't start with a thank you to Two-Way Brewing for suggesting these lecture series. We did one on Beacon 101, and we did the Great Estates, and tonight, of course, we're talking about... That was so lackluster. Tonight we're talking about... That's more like it, people, history lovers. Thank you. Now, I'm going to caution you, I did not have the privilege of growing up in Beacon. I never rode the ferry. I just love history, and I love Beacon in particular. It's really my home and where all my friends and family live. So many of you, I know, had the pleasure of riding the ferry. So please raise your hand if you actually rode the Newburgh Beacon ferry. Wow, I'm going to say that's like half of you, which is just terrific. So I'm hoping that tonight we'll bring back a lot of memories for you. We can't cover everything in 220 years of history for the Newburgh Beacon ferry, but we're going to hit some highlights. And then at the end, if any of you have some stories that you'd like to share about your memories, especially if it's a nice significant anecdote that you'd like to share, hopefully we'll have time for that. So with that, most of you may have realized now that there's no kind of waitress service here, right? So if you want to get up and get another drink during the presentation, feel free to just kind of squeeze by your neighbors. And I will tell you that I love to do slideshows. I love to talk, as most of you who know me will tell you. But IT, maybe not. Maybe I give myself a C+. So there's a moment here or two where we're going to switch to the internet, and God help us, I hope it works. Okay? All right? So if there are any IT gurus here, I'm going to call upon you for your assistance tonight. Now, most of you who are here who remember the ferry have great recollections of it. Tonight we're going to talk about some not so great recollections which led to the construction of the Newburgh Beacon Bridge. But if you remember nothing else from this presentation, please take away the fact that ours was one of the longest running ferries in American history at 220 years of consistent running on the Hudson River. And that's really an important variable. And I do want to start hopefully this works. Is it turned on? See the IT gurus here first turn it on? No. Okay, it just buzzed, so there we go. With a shout out to Bob Murphy, who was our city historian, the president of the Historical Society for 20 years, and the editor of our Historical Society newsletter. 38 years he wrote this fascinating newsletter. And I had the privilege of co-authoring a couple of books with him. He was an encyclopedia of Beacon history. And largely because of his research, I'm able to present a program like this for you tonight. Our door prize this evening is actually a compilation of Bob's 38 years of newsletter writing. And I do have 2 additional copies here tonight if anyone wants to bring them home. I think we have some, they're my planted seeds in the audience. What do you think of the book? Fantastic in a word. Okay, so let me just say that Bob was responsible for a great deal. I love this picture of him. He was so young here. We lost him in 2020. But there's a little Newburgh Beacon Ferry model that he's standing in front of at what was the Howland Center at the time. And I also want to take a few moments to recognize the Hudson River Maritime Museum up in Kingston and the Historical Society of Newburgh Bay and the Hudson Highlands. And I guess everybody who loves history and who wants to celebrate it and preserve it. Many of the images that you'll see tonight were culled from some of these sites. So like all good historians, we should probably start at the very beginning, and you should know that even the indigenous people, the Native Americans who were here, were crossing here at the Hudson River. This is a birch bark canoe. It was built by the indigenous Algonquin people of Canada sometime in the 1930s based upon their historic practices. It now belongs to the Hudson River Maritime Museum in Kingston if you want to go see it. But even in those early years, centuries ago, the American Indians are crossing the river here. But once European settlement comes and there's a need and interest in more crossing and certainly commercial crossing, there's obviously someone who's going to come along as a business person to put in a larger, more dependable ferry than the canoes. So 1743, think about that. Decades before the American Revolution, before we are a nation, when we're still a colony, the colony of New York, Alexander Colden applies for a permit. You may recognize the name Colden because over in Orange County there's Colden Street, there's Coldenham, and his uncle was actually, his father was Cadwallader Colden, who was the colonial governor of New York at one time. So his son, Alexander, is going to apply for a permit from King George II. Now, if it was King George III up there, I would have you boo and hiss appropriately, right? Because he's the one from whom we broke. But he applies and he receives this patent in 1743 to be able to operate officially with the approval of the Crown a ferry between what was, of course, Newburgh and Fishkill at the time. Until 1913, it's called the Newburgh Fishkill Ferry. Ours becomes a critical location, especially during the American Revolution. This is just a map that shows you where the Fishkill Supply Depot was. I think most of you probably know where that is, largely on Route 9 in Fishkill and Fishkill Landing. And there's going to be important people who are crossing here during the American Revolution. There are, for decades, probably centuries, there's going to be a lot of New England migration that wants to head out west, is going to come down and cross here. We know that all those fiery patriots up in Boston are going to want to be in Philadelphia for everything that's happening in the 1770s, and so they're going to cross here at Newburgh. This is the largest, most populous ferry. Verplanck down south is also a commonly used ferry, but we are really a key critical location. Our ferry is so critical, in fact, that when the British sail north to burn Kingston in 1777, they actually fire upon the ferry that is operating here because they want to stop this back and forth traffic on either side of the river. 1782, the Army actually takes over the ferry, takes control of it. It's too critical now with all of Washington's men encamped in the New Windsor Cantonment and Washington himself at Newburgh. It's too critical to allow it to be in civilian hands. The Army actually takes it over. It isn't until we're independent that the private forces will again come in. After the Revolutionary War, that charter from King George is voided, right? All these colonial business people are now free to assume commerce and to be able to, once again, in this case, be back in the ferry business. This is a Wisconsin example of the kind of scow boat that was probably the earliest used boats here. You can see it's flat on either end. It's transporting horses in this case, and it's probably maybe even powered by horses in some of the later years, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Great for transporting materials, and what they want to do at this location too is get those horse-drawn carriages across the river. By 1816, there's a horse-powered ferry that is operating here. So 50 years before the Civil War is happening, how are they going to get across? No longer are they going to probably row or pull themselves across, but they're going to actually use a horse-powered boat. And this one was called the Moses Rogers, named for a man who initially started these team boats, teams of horses. But ironically, if you look up Moses Rogers, his number one thing was that he's remembered for being one of Robert Fulton's captains of the steamboats in later decades. But our ferry here is named in his honor, the Moses Rogers. When you think about our waterfront, it's so critically important that you remember that ours was a bustling port. This was a center of commerce. This is Long Dock that goes out. Anybody here remember when Long Dock was really here? A hand or two in the back. And here we got, the sailboats. Why was the river so important for commerce and for transportation? Because inland roads, they weren't paved. They were muddy. So in the springtime, they were almost impassable. Sometimes you had a corduroy road. That's why it's called Plank Road over in Newburgh. They would put things down on the surface so that they could traverse across it. But for the most part, it becomes seasons of the year where you can't move inland very easily. And so the river affords you this unbelievable ability to move north and south across, up and down the Hudson River. We don't have all images of the ferry, obviously, at all different times, but this is probably one of our earliest. It's a stereopticon view, if you've ever seen a stereopticon. And so while it looks pretty blurred here, this is probably taken from the gate of the house of John Peter DeWint, who we talked about before in these lectures, who owns most of this area of the waterfront. And that's a very early view of what it looked like here on our Hudson River shoreline. We also, I'm not going to go over every single boat that was ever officially the Newburgh Fishkill or the Newburgh Beacon ferry, but you see these are some of the boats that were running, and most of you will probably remember the Duchess, the Orange, and the Beacon, which were running in 1963 when it closed. And likewise, there's a series of owners. Once that King's Charter is repealed, now we're free to sell it back and forth. And so the Carpenter brothers sell it to each other, probably for tax reasons. They were doing those things even back then. And later it does come under John Peter DeWint, who I have starred there. And later to Mrs. Homer Ramsdell, that she was the daughter of Thomas Powell, and she marries Homer Ramsdell. And they're going to be the families that really are going to be most associated in more modern times with the Newburgh Beacon Ferry. Again, I can't cover all of this, and so I'm going to cover a little bit more about the owners, talk about the ferry houses, some of the ferry boats themselves, some of the more compelling stories about the ferry, and then sadly that sad goodbye when it closed. It is so important to discuss John Peter DeWint. He had come from the Netherlands. He had gone to the West Indies. He had made his fortune there in a variety of trades, sugar most importantly, and he comes to Beacon and he builds his house, comes to Fishkill Landing, just up from the landing, just north of what we would know as the ferry terminal area around, Riverfront Park, but on the land side of it. And he builds a very important house. It's an epicenter of culture here. Everybody who is everybody comes to John Peter DeWint's home. He marries the granddaughter of President Adams. The Marquis de Lafayette will come to visit them at their home. His stature is so important. He owns almost all of the waterfront, ultimately, in what we know today as Beacon. And then Homer Ramsdell is a later owner, and even modern times people recognize the name Homer Ramsdell. His estate continued to be the operator of the ferry even after Homer himself passed away. Here's another early view of the waterfront, likely about the 1880s. Traffic is now starting to increase, and they realize here that they really need what we'd consider to be a ferry house, right? Somewhere to sell tickets, buy tickets, move in and out, and control the business a little bit more. The first one that was built was in 1892, and it really had that great, charming tower to it. it reminds me so much, if any of you have been to Disney World, they have that Americana Main Street. Like the building that greets you kind of looks like this. Like it was classic Americana. It was actually designed by a well-known Poughkeepsie architect named Arno Cannon. And if you're a student of local architecture, you'll recognize that. He designed Wilderstein up in Rhinebeck, the Vassar Brothers Institute, which perhaps some of you have visited in Poughkeepsie, the Poughkeepsie Masonic Lodge, which is just magnificent. Here in Beacon, he also designed the Dibble House. Well, he's commissioned to design this ferry structure. It also had a covered walkway, if you can see, so here it is, you recognize the turret. Covered walkway that brought you to what? The train station, exactly. But this area quickly becomes overcrowded. Why? Because passengers from the ferry and the train, and ultimately the trolley now is going to be introduced to the waterfront, are all commingling, all trying to get to different places. And what's going to open in 1902? The Mount Beacon Incline, right? So we've got all kind of tourists who are getting off. They probably took the day liner up. They disembarked in Newburgh, they took the ferry over, they're getting off here, and they all now have to get up to the foot of the mountain in order to go up to the incline. So it's a very busy and congested area. So by 1914, they're actually going to fill in some of the Hudson River waterfront. You can see, you know when you're going south at Dennings Point, and there's a section where there's water on one side of the track, and the track is over here, set away from it. It was similarly here on the waterfront, but they filled all that in. They fill out farther, and they're able to build this second ferry station. It cost $60,000 at the time, which equates now to about $1.8 million. So for the ferry operator, this is a very significant investment in the future of the ferry here. The local newspaper wrote of it, the new structure is one that the residents of Beacon, remember 1914, we've just become a city. So we're really proud of the fact that, you know, we're a brand new city. A structure that the residents of Beacon may well be proud of, and there is not a town along the river that has as fine a ferry terminal. So that's pretty high praise, right? 1914. With the new terminal and the improvements that followed on the railroad, this area becomes more organized and traffic is going to flow better. This train station, of course, doesn't come down really till essentially about urban renewal time. We have fabulous photographs of all of the soldiers departing for World War I, the Newburgh unit, infantry, which departed from Newburgh, and our local boys were in. Thousands of people gathered here. This is where, when Lincoln's casket is brought back to be brought to Illinois, it's going to stop here, and the people from Fishkill Landing and Mattawan are going to go down to the train tracks, and they're going to see the train that is carrying Lincoln's body. So this is a very busy, important part of Beacon, and a part of everyday life of Beacon. It's a thriving port here. With the new terminal improvements that followed, the area became more organized, traffic flowed better. Here's a postcard view of it. You can see boats and trains and trolleys, all traveling through this very busy area. So now I do want to talk a little bit about some of the ferry boats themselves. Here is the boat called the City of Newburgh. It holds the distinction of being the longest running actual boats that are operating on that ferry. Now the ferry itself is going to run for 220 years, but this is the longest running boat. She operates from 1879 until 1939. Her engines, however, were even older. They had been salvaged from a sunken ferry, which was called the Union. It burned on the docks in the city of Newburgh at the ferry terminal there. They salvaged her engine, put it into the new city of Newburgh. That had happened in 1878. She had a companion boat called the Fishkill-on-Hudson, and she probably looked just like this. This could be either the city of Newburgh or the Fishkill Landing. What do you think of Beacon there? Right? A thriving community. I guess it's Fishkill Landing at this time, obviously, but people don't appreciate what a thriving Hudson River port we were. Mattawan, up on the Fishkill Creek at the foot of the mountain, is all about manufacturing and factories. Fishkill Landing, it is a port. And from the days of Madame Brett, when she operates a grist mill here, people are going to be using this to go up and down to New York City. Again, the quickest way that you can get your goods to market is going to be by getting on the Hudson River here. So much of the buildings that you see here were lost to urban renewal, which we've talked about before. The city of Newburgh and the Fishkill Landing both had iron holes, and they were so important here because they were needed to break up what? The ice. The enemy of the ferry was all the ice. The Fishkill-on-Hudson, after it was out of use here and wasn't needed any longer, was actually run across the Long Island Sound. and it transported passengers between Newport and Jamestown, Rhode Island, when she was named the Jamestown. And here's a kind of a colorized scenic view of what our waterfront looked like in about the same period. Can't talk about the ferry in Newburgh and Beacon without discussing the fact that at one point trains crossed on ferry boats here on our waterfront as well. The William T. Hart, and I apologize that I don't have a better clear image of it, but the William T. Hart was a massive train transport ferry. It ran from 1882 until 1914, and it carried all of the cars of the New York and New England Railroad. So they had to get over across the river, and they put them on a ferry boat, the William T. Hart, and they hauled them across. Think about this. At the time, it was the second largest ferry boat operating in the world. Back and forth between Newburgh and Fishkill Landing. 295 feet. It could carry 27 freight cars or 18 passenger cars in every crossing. So imagine being a passenger on the train, having them put your car, taking you across on this, and then you resume your journey over there. The things we take for granted, and when we complain about that toll on the bridge, right? And this kind of shows you, gives you some idea as to how the train lines actually fed into it. You see the ferry boat way over there, the William T. Hart. These are the way the train tracks are going to take you right on board onto that ferry boat. But what's going to happen in 1899? The Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge is going to open. And so it's kind of the beginning of the end for local train transport because it lasts for about 15 years more, but it's easier for them now to take the train and go right up over the bridge, what we know today as the walkway over the Hudson, than it was to load them onto the William T. Hart. Now the boat, the Duchess, was the first screw-propelled ferry boat that was put into service on the Hudson River north of New York City anywhere. It was actually built right in Newburgh by the Thomas Marvell shipyards. It had a hull of steel. It was excellent in winter, breaking the ice, and she operates from 1910 until the ferry closes in 1963. So anybody remember ever taking a ride on the Duchess? Right? A lot of heads nodding. Her sister ship was the Orange. She was built in Newburgh, and she was launched in 1914. She's the first of our ferry boats. Everybody assumes that they were always all what was called Tuscan red. She's the first of the ferry boats that's actually painted that color. All the rest that had come before her were actually painted white, which here you can see the Duchess, when she was painted white. Why did they want to get rid of the white? Because there was so much soot from the stacks that it was too dirty, and the women in particular complained about the soot that they would have to brush off their clothes. She, the Duchess later too is painted Tuscan red to limit the impact of all that soot coming out of the smokestack. The ships initially burned coal, but in later years some of them were burning maritime oil to power their engines. Now the winters of the 1930s were very harsh, and the Newburgh Beacon Ferry realized that it needed a third boat. It had been the Duchess and the Orange pulling all this weight. Third boat in service to break the ice, and that finally brings us to, ta-da, the Beacon. See her little name down there? She had been built, anybody know where she came from? We weren't her first owners, we adopted her. She was built as the Lieutenant Flaherty in 1914 for service in Boston Harbor. She joined our fleet in 1938 and was rechristened the Beacon at that time. She could carry about 45 cars, which actually made her one of the largest ferries in operation on the Hudson River. She and others would be painted green when the ferry is purchased by the New York State Bridge Authority in 1956. More on that in just a little bit. Now, you might be wondering, how much did it cost to ride across the ferry? Well, in the earliest days, it was a quarter of a shilling, whatever that means. This is a schedule from 1924, April of 1924. So my mother was born in 1927, so that seems like modern times to me, 1924. Don't have time to review all of them, but here are just a couple that I marked here up top. A 2-horse pleasure vehicle, 1924, cost you 35 cents. That's about $6 today, each way. So about $12 back and forth. And today on the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, a 2-axle commercial vehicle pays about $6. So it's about half if you consider going back and forth, because they paid 2 ways when they were going on the ferry. Now, a passenger on foot in 1924 paid all of 7 cents. That's about $1.20 today. About $2.40 to cross both ways. And in case you were wondering, in 1924, how much it would cost you to bring your sheep across the Hudson River, it's 3 cents. Okay. Isn't that amazing in 1924, right? I'm not lying, you see it. Sheep or lambs each. Let's not be confused, 3 cents each. Okay. All right, and people, often wonder how often they ran. How reliable could it be? Who wants to go down and wait for the boat to come? Here's an 1888 timetable, and I included it not because I thought that you'd be able to read it, but to show you that for decades, more than a century, this was a big, well-run operation on which commerce and people relied. Okay, so they took all of this very seriously. Here's one from 1914. Dependability is obviously so important to them. Imagine, if you look over on the right, 52 round trips every weekday. Think about that. That's a lot of trips back and forth, right? Some of the other things that it reads on here, because I know it's not best to read it, but see the little image of the car. If you wish to sit in your car for 3/4 of an hour at a ferry landing, this is not the place to come. If, however, you wish to cross the river and be on your way without losing time, this is the ferry to patronize. Because they did have some other options up and down. It's the only ferry on the river that operates 2 boats, has modern screw ferry boats, and that run regularly all year round, because some of the other ferries would shut down due to that ice. They're going to have those steel hulls. They're going to enable them to beat the competition. And they just have some really, it operates all year. Boats run from early morning until late at night. 20 to 30 automobiles may accommodate it at one time. So this was a big operation. And think about what it meant for the traffic of people who are driving in. You're coming from Connecticut, you're coming from Westchester County. You're going to come through Beacon. Hopefully you're going to patronize the businesses that are here, right? So this was an important component of Beacon's economy here. Here's another one. An ideal ferry for motorists runs from 6 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. You don't need a timetable because we are so reliable. That's quite a claim to make to people that are trying to run a business and people who are trying to make trains and other things. This is a good one here. The ferries made it easy for folks from Westchester and Connecticut, maybe even Long Island, to cross here on their way to the Borscht Belt of Sullivan County. See all the Sullivan County resorts. Who's ever watched, what's the movie? Dirty Dancing. That's what we're talking about here. How did they get here? Well, they crossed the Newburgh Beacon ferry to take that lascivious lifestyle, right? All right. The ferry operated under the slogan of cross here and save time. This was a going concern, completing 52 crossings every day. It was the only ferry service north of New York City that was running 2 boats and that was operating throughout the winter. Here's a 1950s view of what it looked like to approach Beacon's ferry terminal on the Hudson. Cool, right? I just acquired this image online. You'd be surprised what comes up on eBay, right? You wonder now, okay, so it's these great boats, it's so dependable, what could go wrong? What on earth could go wrong? Well, the weather was a big part of what went wrong. This is ice in the river. Ice in particular was kind of the nemesis of it. It caused all kind of problems for the ferries. And again, the bridges at Bear Mountain and at Poughkeepsie aren't built till the 1920s. So if you want to cross the river here, this is how you're going to cross the river, right? Unless you're going to drive all the way to Poughkeepsie or all the way down to Bear Mountain. And so whether there was ice or not, you needed the ferry boat to operate. Here are some other examples of some extreme delays here. Ferry boat stuck in the ice, mild weather, clogged the channel here. 40 stranded as ice halts the ferry 6 hours later. Here were ferries who got lost in the fog, and there was the owner, the Ramsdale estate comes out and says, no, my ferries didn't get lost in the fog. There was a problem at the dock, and that's why they didn't get in. So, it really was subject to Mother Nature and her whims and a lot of other operating things that maybe we, in our idyllic version, in our memories, we forget conveniently about some of this. 2 ferries freed from the ice, new jam predicted. Jim Russell, anybody recognize that byline? He later worked at Central Hudson, so this is an old Newburgh Beacon Evening News. But suffice to say that weather really wreaked havoc in many respects, despite the fact that they were so dependable. So many people were counting on them. So now if this works, this is the first of 3 little clips that I'm going to play, okay? And hopefully it's going to work. And I'm sorry, I've got to get my computer there right behind you. If you can just scoot over to the left a little bit, we'll be just fine. I don't want to trip over you either. So this is a quote, a little audio clip that I'm going to play by a woman named Betty Carey. How many of you know Betty Carey, right? She's gone now, but Betty lived here in Beacon. I better get my glasses, everyone, before I trip and I do this wrong. And she's talking about what happened to a friend of hers one night on the ferry. Yeah. Push it as far as you can, as far as you can. Keep going. How about?
You got it.
Up until 1960,
Can you hear that?
Newburgh Beacon Bridge was completed. Beacon residents took the ferry to Newburgh regularly.
And if it's difficult to hear, you can find this online. You can find the other 2 clips I'm going to play tonight online as well.
The girl that I used to have for a babysitter when my kids were little,
You hear that?
used to go to Newburgh Friday nights to roller skate, and she got stuck on that boat that got frozen in the river. They were there all night. She said they had a great time. And the river channel was on the Newburgh side. There used to be an ice credit, but not very nice. We got the ice in the river. Out of the bay, even the chopped up ice would pile up in there. That was one of the things that was great to watch when you're riding it, to watch the ferry pull in and churn that ice, and then would back up and go in again, clear it out, and then to watch it get through. But the ice froze up so hard, so solid that night, they couldn't get the ferry in, so they had to stay out in the river till morning.
Can you imagine?
But she said they had a pool where you sang and danced and had some food to eat, and it was warm enough. They got the fires going. She had a good time. But only twice that I know of that it never got stopped and it couldn't make its schedule true. Ice wasn't found.
There were stories about people in the at sand and snow.
Okay, could you hear that? Be honest. Yeah. All right. All right. Hopefully, then it's going to stop playing and we're going to go back to our slideshow with minimal interruption here. So, ice was a problem. Can you imagine spending all night on that boat? Although it sounds like they had a pretty darn good time given the circumstances. And even when she says they kept the fires burning to keep them warm, there was no heat. Imagine being out in the middle of the Hudson River with no heat. So, it wasn't the idyllic picture that we sometimes all remember. There was flooding in the springtime here. Riverfront flooded as Hudson rises to highest mark in years. Ferry service halted. We all have seen the Hudson, right? When it comes up in its tidal and the issues that it can cause. But think about the fact that the far right clipping is talking about a labor dispute, a strike by the workers on the ferry. So it had all kind of issues that they had to deal with. They also had to deal with the complexity of mud. This is the Daily News front page, the New York Daily News front page, and it was perhaps the most notorious of the mud incidents here. Duchess bows to mud. The Newburgh Beacon Ferry Duchess is high but not too dry after running aground on a mud bank after leaving the Beacon slip. Light boats carried 20 passengers ashore. This is the most famous of the incidents. I'm going to tell you why. In 1951, the ferry boat Orange had gotten stuck in the mud. A year earlier, the USS battleship, the Missouri, had gotten stuck down in the Chesapeake Bay, and it made national headlines. They couldn't get this battleship out of the Chesapeake Bay, and that ship's nickname was Mo, and Mighty Mo, and so ours became Little Mo. And it makes news all across the country that Little Mo wouldn't go either, and they couldn't get the ferry boat out of the mud. It became so popular that even there were T-shirts made. Did anybody have one? Oh, okay. All right. He should have saved his, Paul says over here. You don't remember that. Do you remember being stuck in the mud?
Yes, a little bit.
A little bit? Okay, yeah. You know.
I remember the T-shirt though. He leaned over right before.
Oh, okay. And the T-shirt. There we go. I worked at Central Hudson. I mentioned that, and the chairman of the board. I said to him once, "Oh God, wasn't it so sad when the ferry closed down?" Because I love history, right? Who wouldn't want to ride a ferry and be stuck in the mud? And he said, "Oh my God, it was awful. You'd go down there and you'd wait, and sometimes you'd be the last car and you couldn't get on, so you had to wait for the next one to come, and it would get stuck, and there were problems with ice, and it was so undependable." And that kind of gave me a different perspective. So I try to keep an open mind. But regardless, it was time to go. So on Sunday, November the 3rd, 1963, shortly after 5 o'clock, the Duchess and the Orange, now owned by the Bridge Authority and painted green, as I mentioned earlier, met at mid-river. They signaled the final salute to one another, and they formally retired the Newburgh Beacon Ferry into history after 220 years. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try this again. This is the Newburgh City historian, Mary McTammany, and she rode on that last ferry as a child, and she's going to talk about what it was like. Is that all the way up?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, it's up to 10 as you go. Yeah.
But I can't hear. Will it go further? What?
You haven't opened it.
Oh, I haven't opened it. Duh. Who's paying attention here? Thank God my child is here to keep me humble. There we go.
Ferry ran was Sunday, November 3rd, 1963. And it was a dual fare. I still have my ticket. You got a fare to go one way on the bridge and one way on the ferry. Take your pick. So you could ride over on the ferry and then home on the bridge. Or over on the bridge and home on the ferry. And so Newburgh and Beacon residents did that, and others from all around the valley, I'm sure, to just have the fun of it. And so we packed everybody into the car, and off we went to Beacon on the ferry. And it was very sad to ride it because we all ran out of the car, of course, and stood at the rail, looked over, tried to kind of savor all the things about it. I mean, 1963, I was a senior in high school. And so you tried to savor everything about it. Oh, remember this one? Let's try to remember that. Oh, yeah, that's the one. Wow, look at how it disappears in the distance here. And when we got to the other side, the boat off we went and up the road. And now we went up Route 9.
And she means 9D.
Ramp onto the Newburgh Beacon Bridge. And I remember driving out onto that bridge, and it was so high. You hadn't been on a low-rail bridge before. We drove out on this little two-lane bridge. It wasn't big like it is today. Little two-lane bridge. Low rails, and we were way up in the air. And you just cruised home to Newburgh on the new concrete and back down to your home and said, well, that was it. And we'll never ride the ferry again. So, you could look down over the rail because with a two-lane bridge, with the low rails, you could see north and south very easily. And so as you drove back home, everybody strained to look at the ferry still crossing, still going back and forth, making as many runs that day as it could. Everybody hollered bye-bye to the ferry, and then you were home.
Aw. Bittersweet, right? Bye-bye to the ferry. We're going to do it from Kern? No. What?
On the play button.
Okay, I know, but I needed to get it full size. I had to, okay? I'm not as stupid as I look. Okay, all right. So he's got a little intro here that he put down here. You'll have to put up with this. So this is from the Newburgh side. That's what their ferry terminal looked like. We were very fortunate a few years ago to co-sponsor with the Newburgh Historical Society an exhibit over in Newburgh about the ferry. I didn't realize there's a piece of tape hanging off the wall here. So a lot of the bridge, the new bridge is built here. Imagine what that looked like when, after all their lives of living here, and there was nothing like that on there. And of course, there was only one lane. We know it today as two sections of the bridge. There was only one, and cars are passing, across each other. Now we're coming into the Beacon station. Look at them all dressed up. Is that cute or what? Right? They got ties and jackets on. She's got a little baby she's holding. There it is, the Beacon. And the car's there. That's essentially it. Okay, now, bear with me here. It's different on the screen than it is up there. Okay, that's the last video. How about a round of applause for that? Woo! All right. But I wanted to include them, right? Didn't that give you a fun perspective? And to hear Mary's firsthand account when she's a historian of what it was like. In this great photograph, you see that $22 million bridge is just being completed here. And actually, the Historical Society has a representative coming from the New York State Bridge Authority at our September meeting who's going to talk about the history of the Newburgh Beacon Bridge. And everybody's welcome. That's September the 26th at the Elks Club. Here's a really sad picture, in my opinion. The Orange and the Beacon are being towed away by a tugboat called Sheila Moran. It was the end of their last season in 1963. So you see them there queued up behind each other. They were actually towed downriver and sold to, anybody want to guess? A Staten Island salvage yard for $4,700. The Orange fared a little bit better. Remember there was those three boats, the Duchess, the Orange, the Beacon. The Orange fared a little bit better. It was bought by a ferry enthusiast who wanted to save it. She took it to the World's Fair in 1964 and it participated in that, but she left it on a dock and it was vandalized in Staten Island a few years later and then ultimately sold for salvage in 1966. So all three of them essentially were scrapped for salvage. Our ferry terminal was raised in 1968, sadly, and for the next 42 years all we had were photographs and fond memories of what it was like, and that's until 2005. And on Friday, October the 14th of that year, ferry service returned through a partnership with the New York Waterways that runs ferries at several locations in the metro New York area already. It runs weekdays during commuter hours, and we should all be grateful for the fact that our then mayor, Clara Lou Gould, fought to be able to bring back the ferry. We couldn't bring it back in its original grand incarnation with cars and all of that. And why? Because the bridge was there, we didn't need that. But she did recognize the nostalgic feeling that we have. The ferry, like the mountain and the incline, are kind of members of our family. And she fought really hard to bring the ferry back to Beacon. And if you are quick, as you are crossing the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, heading towards Beacon, you can catch a glimpse of this bell. Have any of you ever seen it? It's right there. Now, don't cause any accidents, people. But just as you kind of leave the part that's over the water and you're approaching what were the old offices there, if you look to your right, you will see, this is here, Luigi Di Dominicus, for those of you who are Beacon people know that he built this for the Bridge Authority. That is the bell that, I want to make sure that I get it right. It was used to call ferries through the fog. So it wasn't on a ferry boat, but it stood on our ferry shoreline, and it would call them so that they would know where they could go. And imagine how hard that was to be able to know where to dock in those days before there was electricity. Imagine how difficult. So this bell is still there. It's one of the last vestiges that you can find. If you walk, and I don't see people walking on the bridge anymore. You used to be able to walk and ride your bike on the bridge. But if you walk down, you'd actually be able to stand there. Can you still walk? Okay, so everybody, that's your assignment. After this, get your steps in and take a walk across the bridge so you can see this bell. This is a photograph that I just got from Eddie Mendoza here. It's one of his father's photographs. I have a caveat in here for you. In August, our August meeting of the Historical Society, August 22nd, we are going to take the new ferry across the Hudson River. We're going to have dinner at Billy Joe's with a talk by Mary McTammany, who was the historian who you heard speaking here, and then take the last ferry back to Beacon. Sounds great, right? Well, it's almost full. So if you're interested, please send me an email at beaconhistorical@gmail.com to reserve your spot. There's 40 spots in the room in the restaurant, and 32 have already been reserved by folks. I think it's going to be very popular. What I may do, if we get beyond 40, is have other people sit in another room, and the historian will just come out and talk to you in another room, because our room only seats 40. That's the limitation. The ferry itself is great. And so, folks, this is our last stop. We have to get off the ferry now. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for your patience as I work through a couple of IT issues there. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that we can stay now. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And so before we draw our door prize and you get your next beer, I hope you'll stay and patronize them. It's very nice of them to host us here. I was hoping that some of you might raise your hand and tell us a little memory. Okay, here she is. She's very shy. Marianne Cheddar, stand up. She's going to tell us a Ferry story, okay? Stand up. Stand up.
She has great stories about this ferry.
All right, let's hear a few. All right.
So, summarize.
Well, first of all, yes, I drove the ferry, rode on the ferry for a whole number of years. At that time, there was no other way to get across. So we had relatives in Scranton, Pennsylvania, my grandparents. We lived on Magnolia Farm, which was just north of Beacon at that time. So in order to visit them, you had to go across the ferry. Going in the morning was fine, but there were traffic jams. Coming back on a Sunday afternoon, if any of you remember Newburgh, there were hilly roads that came down, and you would line up on these roads, and it took a long time to get back across the ferry.
Wow, wow.
But in addition to that, I went to high school on the ferry. I traveled to high school on the ferry for 4 years. There were 2 Catholic high schools. Mount St. Mary's was a girls' school, St. Patrick's was a boys' school.
Yeah.
And so there were easily probably 30 or 40 of us between the 2 schools that commuted every single day all the time.
Can you imagine taking the ferry to school and then you had to walk up the hill to the mount, right? No?
No, we took city buses.
Oh, when you got to Newburgh, okay.
When I was a freshman, which would have been in 1952, we went, like my friend and I would walk up, we lived in Teller Avenue at that time, we moved here. Walked up Teller Avenue, took a city bus, Beacon city bus, to the train station, to the ferry. Got on the ferry, went across, and then took a Newburgh city bus up to Mount St. Mary's or the boys' school if necessary.
Wow.
Coming down in the afternoon, we'd walk down because it was really nice, and then do the same thing coming back. By my junior year, there was a school bus.
Oh.
So that at the end of Main Street in Beacon, you would get on the bus and go across, and it would take you there.
The whole bus would go across on the ferry? Oh, no. Okay, the bus let you off there. Very good.
And then they would take
Wow.
us there. And then my friends had cars when we were seniors, so we were.
And so when you got on the ferry with your car, I see people standing outside. Did you sit in your car or you had to get out of your vehicle?
Well, it was such a short ride, you didn't really get out. But as
You didn't,
going to
okay.
high school, we were walkers, so to speak.
Yep, okay.
So if you will notice in the one picture of the ferry, there were men's side and a women's side.
Yep.
It was the strangest thing, a sign of the times, I guess. I never went on the men's side of the ferry.
Well, so initially the reason for that was the fact that so many men smoked cigars, and they would stand there and if the women weren't on the other side of the boat, all that cigar smoke would go down the boat to where women were standing, and so it was the cigars primarily that created that two-sided system.
So the boys would go on the men's side, and we would go
Wow.
on the women's side, and, of course, we're fooling around back and forth in the front and back of the boat, but that's just how it was.
All right, she will be at the bar later tonight, and she's going to tell all the other fun stories that happened in Newburgh. Other folks, Bob, hey, what do you want to tell us about the ferry?
We used to go out, I was in a service, we used to come up from Virginia, and we'd always try to rush up there and make, for 12 o'clock was the cutoff, that was the stop, and we'd have to rush through it. And one time I picked up the hitchhiker on a night out.
That's a story for another night, I think. Yeah.
And the only thing is, when I stopped at the ferry, we made it through. But it was a rough.
Yeah.
We, from the Beacon side, when I was a little kid, my mother would take us across, and we walked all the time there. We walked out of the river. Newburgh was great at that time.
Yeah.
We walked.
For those of you that don't know, Water Street was there in Newburgh. It too was lost to urban renewal. And Beacon people did all their shopping there, right? On Water Street.
Yeah, it's great.
Now, Judy Marr behind you was telling me about what her family used to do in the summertime on the ferry.
Kids in our neighborhood would be dropped off
Nice and loud.
at 8 o'clock in the morning and ride the ferry all day. Somebody else to get bored.
Because it was cool, right? In an era before air conditioning and pools. Send your kid down there and ride back and forth. Yes. Nice and loud.
I grew up in Garrison. We, of course, in the early 60s, had no air conditioning. So on hot summer days, my mother would drive up to the Beacon Ferry, put 2 girls on, put us on, and then cross the river back and forth to cool down.
Wow. So maybe 1 or 2 more. Anybody else? Denny Meyer, you got a story for us?
Yeah, my grandma.
I'm going to need you to turn the lights on when we do that. Well, I'll tell you when.
And we would take the ferry over to the road out there, Daymire, which would go down the Hudson
Yeah.
East River over to Playland at White Beach, and then back to So the day comes, start at 6 in the morning, 5:30.
Wow. Wow.
We didn't get back until, I don't know.
I meet so many people who tell me that their family, worked on the ferry in one capacity or another. It was a really strong bond here. Yes.
My father and grandfather
Stand up, nice and loud. Tell us. Her father and your grandfather did what?
worked on the ferry.
Worked on the ferry. Do you know what they did? Were they?
My grandfather took tokens,
Oh, okay, great.
and my father shoveled coal, put it on the truck, and brought it onto the ferry.
Wow, imagine, I don't know if everybody heard her, the one took the tokens and the other shoveled coal and put it into the ferry. So, one more story. Anybody have a story for us? Come on, I know you're not all that young. You're not fooling me. They're going over there? Go ahead, I couldn't see it. Go ahead, yes. Yes, please. Nice and loud.
The last day of the ferry, I was a sophomore in Ketchum. Each of the high schools picked a handful of kids.
When I tell you, go over there now, yeah.
We got there early in the morning, it was really cold. The warmed up was sitting, we were back and forth. But they gave us assignments. So you either had to write something or draw something,
Wow.
and then the bus dropped us off and we picked us up and took us back to the school.
Wow, wow. So it's really a big part of life here, in other words, and I really regret that I didn't have an opportunity to experience it firsthand. All right, we've come to the happy point where we're going to draw for our door prize. If we can turn up the house lights. Where's my famous glasses? I like to brag on her a little bit, so I'm going to ask our West Point graduate if she would draw our door prize today. What happened to my glasses? I lose my glasses 15 times a day. Who's with me in that? Right? That builds character, doesn't it? Okay. I do want to thank Mary Beth is a West Point graduate. Will you join me in thanking her and all of our veterans for their military service? So our door prize tonight is a copy of our fabulous book, 38 Years of Beacon Historic Site Newsletter. It's like a textbook. It's huge. Thank God you didn't have to carry this up and down the hill. Right? And I have 2 of these for sale tonight. I can take either cash or PayPal if you'd like to bring this home. Little small vignette stories about the history of Beacon that I promise you, no matter how many years you have lived here, you will enjoy this book. All right, our lucky winner tonight, and you have to have your picture taken, so be prepared for that. 511-550. So the last 4 numbers are 1550. Come on now, only 1 or 2 people snuck out. You got to be in here. Is it because I said you have to take your picture with me that you're not fessing up? No? Can we draw again? One of the last? All right, maybe it was this.
I already bought it, so I don't.
You sure? All right, okay, so this, we're going to draw again because he's lucky enough to already have a copy. This is my son, Brett. Everybody give him a round of applause for helping me set up tonight. Named after the Madam Brett Homestead here in Beacon. He was about 9 till his brothers realized his name wasn't Bread. Okay, 511-525. 525. 525, the last 3 numbers? Come on now. You're hurting my feelings at this point. 525. In the back? Who's 524? Do you have it? Come on. Who's got it?
No, I said I got 24. Is that close enough?
Well, all right. Do you have the book? All right, come on. It's close enough. Who's with me on that? All right. Okay. Got the thing? Okay. He's 524. We all agreed we can give him the door prize tonight. All right. What's his ticket? Did he give it to somebody? All right. Okay. Now I know it. Close. Now it's close as counts, right? All right. We're going to step forward a little bit because of the light. And there's my husband over there. All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We will be here in September, and oh, here we go. I forgot to okay. Sorry. So, meat is murder. Tasty, tasty murder. Okay. We'll be here in September, and in honor of Labor Day, we'll be talking about many of the great products that were made in Beacon. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you. hate that screen like that.